Hello, my name is Erin Morrison, and I'm excited to talk to you this evening about FERPA and just helping us as educators become more familiar with the latest changes and what it means to our schools themselves. So the first thing to know is actually what is FERPA. So this is a federal law, so we are required as school districts to comply with it. It was actually passed in 1974. And what FERPA really says is that school districts must maintain the confidentiality of all personally identifiable information related to students. So this prevents schools from sharing student data without parental consent if the student is under 18, or with student consent if they are over the age of 18. So the first question becomes, what rights are granted under FERPA? So there's quite a few rights. The first one is the rights of parents and adult age students to inspect their copy of student records. They also have the right to deny access to others, so specifically those outside of the school district, with some exceptions. So this could be split families, divorced families. It could be military if a student decides to opt out of that. It also gives the parents and the student a right to correct any errors that they deem they can find within their records, and they can actually request a hearing to make that happen. And they also have the right to opt out of students' directory information as well. So as we talk about FERPA, the first thing to really think about is educational records and what these truly are. So these are records that are directly related to a student, and they're maintained by an educational agency. So in our case, it would be our school district, so USD 458. These would be the records that may be inside the counseling office. They may be at the district office, could be attendance records, discipline records, anything like that. And FERPA permits, so it does not allow a school or the district to disclose the educational records without appropriate parent or adult student consent. So some of the examples of educational records, these could be the grades of a student, immunization health records, disciplinary records, progress reports, any sort of academic history, testing results, grade point average, or even attendance records. Then we talk a little bit more specifically about what is personal identifiable information. So this is the information that is protected, and these are any and all records. So they're either online or paper copies, so any form of record that contains a student's name and address, as well as that of a parent or a family member, social security number or a student's ID number. So for us, the state of Kansas has a student ID number for all students, so we cannot disclose that information. It also includes a list of personal characteristics or other information that would make the student's identity easily traceable. So this wouldn't be anything like a phone number or an address or anything. It could actually be height and weight as well. Now, FERPA does permit school districts to disclose student information if there is a judicial order. So a subpoena, something like that coming from the courts, would allow us to disclose this information. We could also disclose it if it was in connection with a health or safety emergency, or if a student is engaged in a crime of violence or a sex offense. Now, I said initially that FERPA was put into law in 1974, so there have been some amendments to FERPA, and most specifically in 2009, they added biometric records as part of the personal identifiable information. And so this includes fingerprints, retina and iris patterns, voice prints, DNA, facial characteristics, and handwriting. So those are some other things that to take into account when you're deciding if you can disclose the information to an outside source. So directory information is actually something that the school can publish and that they can release to the public. So this can include descriptive information such as the name, address, telephone number, date of birth. If you're in a college or a post-secondary school, it could be your field of study, school activities. And that could include other things such as email address, photographs, grade level, enrollment status. Now, as I stated earlier as well, one thing to remember about directory information is parents and students are given the right to opt out of this. So they can decide that they do not want this information disclosed. And so they can sign papers, or most of the time with enrollment, like for our school district, we do have a FERPA opt-out form. And so this is for the directory information where families and parents choose not to have that information published. Now, the big question is, how does this affect schools? And this is a tricky one because not just the records of students' data is what we have to think about, but it's actually some of the electronic data that students are generating on a daily basis about themselves. So as we as educators are asking them to do, fun little slide presentations, tell us a little bit about more about you, things like that. That's why a lot of times school districts will have secured networks. So you have to actually have an email address within the school district to access anything there. And Forsman actually says that FERPA has become out of touch with modern classrooms and the digital age because when it was created in 1974, obviously everything was paper. So we're talking paper files, paper records, all that kind of stuff, where nowadays it's all so easily accessible online. And it becomes the school's responsibility to make sure that that is being protected by our vendors, by any outside resources, educational resources that we're using as well. And more than 120 student privacy laws have actually been passed since 2013 that are working to strengthen the FERPA laws. And one of the things that Cunningham says is that schools should always be thinking and asking themselves, why are we holding this information? How long should we hold it? And who are we allowing to have access? So in our school district, we typically hold on to student records in the counseling office for 5 years. After that point, we either shred the hard copies of the files or we wipe our student information system for records that are quite old. So we have multiple steps in place that take care of destroying that information so it cannot be accessed. One of the big pieces at the high school specifically, sometimes at the middle school, is actually talking about law enforcement. So what kind of rights does law enforcement have to student information? So the first one is that FERPA does permit a school district to disclose educational records under the Health or Safety Emergency Act, and that's without obtaining prior written consent. So if you know that a student is in imminent danger, if there is a law subpoena out for a student, anything like that, school districts can comply to that request by law enforcement. And school districts also may disclose directory information without the parent's consent, especially if it's an emergency. So if there is a safety concern or anything like that. And then the last piece is talking about surveillance recordings. And I know in our school, we use our camera system quite extensively. So surveillance recordings that are created and maintained by a school's law enforcement unit, so like your SRO, they are not educational records and they are therefore not confidential. So a law enforcement officer could indeed obtain those and take a look at those. So then the last piece to think about and the last question is, what can schools do to stay in compliance? So the first one is kind of the point of this presentation, and it's just making sure that all employees understand what FERPA means. So know what data there is, what you need to protect, what you can disclose. And also know that FERPA applies to any school receiving federal funding. So in this case, it's a public school. It would be USD 458, Basehor Linwood School District. It would be FERPA, it directly applies to us. The third one would be making sure that old records are being properly destroyed. The fourth one is screening vendors to make sure they're FERPA compliant. So just need to make sure when you are talking to vendors is asking them how the vendors give parents and students access to those records and how they prevent unauthorized people from accessing those same records. And then lastly, educators can share information about a student internally. So that's within the school. And this is kind of need to know information. So for instance, this would be a 504 plan or an IEP. So those can be shared with the teachers who have those students in the classroom so that they know what sort of accommodations a student is requiring and how to better educate them. So last but not least, I have my resources, and these are all of the sources that I used to create this presentation. But please, if you have any questions at all, don't hesitate to ask. Again, my name is Erin Morrison, and thank you so much for listening.